Hello, this is Corby Anderson here at the studios of GrassRoots Community Television in Aspen, Colorado. We're here today as part of the Aspen Veterans History Project, which is an oral history project to record the histories of these veterans from the Roaring Fork Valley and submit them to the Library of Congress and also to the Aspen Historical Society and to air on GrassRoots Television to get these amazing histories on tape while we can. Today, it's my honor to host an interview with Captain Lee Shoaf. Lee is here. He is 85 years old, born on July 16th, 1922 in Iowa. Is that correct?
Waterloo, Iowa, yes.
Tell me a little bit about your upbringing. What was it like being raised in Waterloo, Iowa?
Strictly a Midwest. In and out of Waterloo a lot, and but always in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, and my father was in newspaper advertising, so the procedure with that particular profession was move. To advance, you move.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw a lot of Iowa, a lot of Illinois, and so forth, but and so when we got to that phase of it, why we moved into college activity, which was University of Wisconsin, which is where I was when I joined the Air Force. And in fact, I always joke about, I say my generation was kind of the cannon fodder generation. We had the luxury of being born and raised during the Depression, and my freshman year, or not my freshman year, I graduated as a senior in high school. Hitler invaded the Netherlands. So we were the prime group to do business with him.
You grew up in the Midwest during the Depression. What was that like as a child? Did it affect your family? Is it your dad's job? Was it?
No, that was probably one of the advantages of being in the newspaper business like he was. They had a very effective procedure worked out where a lot of the, like advertising for a newspaper, was paid for with credits or due bills or so forth, you know. So really no big strain, just a little bit different way of doing business is about it.
Where's your family from? Are you descendants?
Well, my father was from Indiana and my mother was from Waterloo, and that's where they met. And
how far back does your family go in America?
Well,
have you done any history of your
way
family?
back. I mean, my father's side was Indiana, down around Crawfordsville, Turkey Run in that area, and of course my mother's family was all Iowa. They were all corn-fed, and so I don't know how many generations they go back. I never really have chased it.
Where are your descendants from? Do you know? Are they native Europeans or?
Well, I would say that there's my father's side, the Shoaf line, would go back to Europe. It was Dutch and German. My mother's side, Reed and so forth, they were Irish and so forth. So it's a good mongrel mix.
So let's jump forward to about your high school years, right before you joined the Army, and talk a little bit about what your high school activities were like and what you did, what you
well, it was
interests were.
pretty much standard for high school. I had, there's one interesting aspect of it. I happened to this town of Dixon, Illinois, where I went to high school, was also the hometown of Ronald Reagan. So we had a lot of activity involved around Reagan and Dixon and so forth. And that's Dixon's claim to fame. And
did you know Ronald Reagan?
Well, I had an unusual experience. In '41, that was my come home of the first year of college, and they were having an event in Dixon, and there was back in those days there was Luella Parsons. She was a columnist and very renowned, #1 in Hollywood. And Reagan was just getting started in that time. And so they had a Ronald Reagan Luella Parsons Day. And it was very interesting. That year I had a job selling cars, and the fellow that I worked for, I said, "No, Don," I said, "I want to get a good shot at this thing." They had a big estate there in Dixon, Walgreens Drug Estate. Well, they're from Dixon. Huh. And so I ended up with the job of chauffeuring Reagan around for 3 or 4 days in the town's biggest Buick convertible, owned by George Beyer, the bakery man, you know. And it was a great experience.
Did you share common goals or interests in your life? Did you discuss anything with him coming from the same town? He's probably a little bit older than you.
Well, yes, he's older than I am.
He's older than you.
But no, it was I was just a chauffeur, but he was a great person.
Okay.
Great person. I mean, everything you hear good about him is true.
So in high school, did you have interests in politics or in sports or?
Usually athletics. Usually athletics. Struggled at all of them, but enjoyed playing them. You know what I mean?
Did you have an eye on what was happening, the sort of gathering storm in Europe and Japan?
Well, you go back and review the newspapers during the 30s and the 40s, and you had to be blind not to realize what was going on in the world.
Did you have a sense that you were going to be a part of this as it happened, or?
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Especially when I mentioned when Hitler started into the Netherlands, well, you know, that really kicked it off, and then it gained momentum from there on. And they're organizing draft boards, they're teaching the towns to black out and stuff like that. In fact, I listed in the Air Force at Camp Grant up at Rockford, Illinois. And my dad called me one day at school, and he says, "Son," he says, "you know, they were very slow swearing in at Air Force. It took 9 months to get in after they got you enlisted." And he said, they're calling me, and they said, "You better get that kid into the service because we're going to have to draft him." So I called up to Rockford and called the enlisting people up there, and they told me to come up immediately, and I'll never forget it. They took me over to a little cottage where the commanding officer of Camp Grant was eating his lunch, and while he sat there with his fork in his hand, he swore me into the Air Force. And it's interesting, the little cottage that he lived in at that time is still there, and Camp Grant is a big airfield now. It's a Rockford Airport. But so that was how I got into the Air Force.
How did you decide to join the Air Force? Did you have friends that were also deciding, or how did it go?
Well, yeah, I did, and most of them did too, but it was just kind of a matter of your druthers. You know, you like to play football or you like to play basketball. And
did you talk to your dad about it, or your mom? Or?
Well, although that had a little bearing on it too, that's a good thought. My father was an aerial gunner in World War I.
Ah.
And I flew. I had a little airplane, and I flew for one in the military.
So in high school, you had a plane?
Well, this was right after high school. This is when I got out. And in fact, it's very interesting. I almost ended up in the Canadian Air Force. There was a bunch of my friends, and they were after me to go up there, and I chickened out, I guess. But and I just wanted to be fly a fighter. That was all.
Growing up, listening, did your dad talk about his experiences?
Oh yes.
And he was in a biplane probably.
Oh
in the back
yeah,
with
the open pit,
50 caliber
cockpit, you know, with the flexible guns back there and so forth. Oh yeah,
wow.
He was, in fact, he was an instructor. And
did he see combat?
No, he never got overseas, but those weren't very much airplanes they were flying back in those days either. But
so you were inclined towards flight at a young age. Then you had models of planes and.
Yeah, well, he was interested. So you know, it's just like pitching baseball. They wanted me to be a baseball pitcher, so I threw a lot of pitches.
What age did you first sit behind the yoke or the steering wheel of a plane? Did control it
good
all
Lord, I would have probably been 20.
20?
in that age.
With your dad, or?
No, he never flew, but he never piloted. I should say he flew a lot because he had me flying him all over all the time. We had a lot of fun doing that, a lot of good memories.
Where did you fly to with your dad?
Well, it would be local flying out of the Dixon area.
For work for him, or?
No,
just for fun?
It was just leisure, just leisure flying. We go up and down the Rock River chasing ducks.
So you had decided that it was either the Canadian Air Force or the American Army Corps, or Air Corps, the Army Air Corps.
That's what it was, yeah.
And decided to go with the U.S. Army?
Well, yeah, if I got involved with the military, I wanted it to be the United States military.
How is there even an option that you could join the Canadians?
Well, it was all volunteer, is what it was. And this was prior to the time that and then it progressed to the stage where either I had to enlist in something, because they were drafting people. They had a draft all set up. And back in those days, there was a little different attitude about the military. I mean, and I consider the obligation and the privilege to serve your company. And there was no...
What did you leave? Let's talk about getting on. Did you get on a bus to go to Camp Grant, or?
No, we drove
drive?
up there. Well, let's see.
How'd that go?
No, when I was called up, finally I was called down to San Antonio, and at that time the Air Force had a system where you went into what they called a classification, and you had three choices. If you got into the officer part of it, bombardier, navigator, pilot, and they classified you. And then you went into a pre-flight, and then which was the first phase, and it was all ground school. And from then you started into the flying part of it.
So when you walked through the gates of Camp Grant and said, "I'm here to enlist," from there on out, did they have you?
Yeah, they had me. I mean, I was traveling on their trains and their tickets and so forth.
And did you leave behind any? You left behind your family? Did you have brothers, sisters?
No, I was the only child.
And a girlfriend, or anything that would sort of like?
Well, I had a couple of friends. Yeah, you got to be sociable.
But you weren't leaving a wife to be sitting there waiting?
No, nobody.
So fairly strings unattached, that is?
Completely.
Great. And so what was it like in training?
Well, it was very interesting. As I told you, we went down to San Antonio. They had a pre-flight there, and they had a classification. So I took the first two phases there. And then at that time, then you moved in to what they call primary flight training. And then 2 months of that, and then you move up into a bigger aircraft, basic, and then you went into an advanced, and of course bigger airplanes, bigger power, more power, and so forth as you went along, and then you graduated, got your wings and your bars.
Talk about the difference between the types of people who became pilots and those who became bombardiers. What did you have that separated yourself? From fighter pilot, from bomber pilot, and confidence, or?
Well, it was more a personality situation. They were all great guys, and they all had tough jobs, and it was just kind of your personality about the size of it. Like when I went through classification, and they, said, name your choice, what you want. I said, pilot, pilot, pilot. I put it down 3 times, and
no doubt.
It's the same way about the type of flying you do at that time, and of course I wanted single engine, I wanted fighter. I saw a recent TV program about what was a Memphis Belle or something. It was a B-17 bomber in Europe, 8th Air Force, and I'm just sitting there watching that thing saying, man, I made the right decision.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I did. Because I saw those that bomber activity I had a real cozy seat flying around going to see those 1,000-plane raids go over, see some of those boys. I had an interesting experience one time. I was flying back from a mission, and we flew in pairs doing the work I was doing, and oftentimes we get jumped and we get separated, so we'd just have to go home. You'd have the fellow doing the reconnaissance work, he'd be flying, and the second fellow would be flying his wing cover for it. And I'm flying home, and I got up there by Aachen, and I found a parachute coming down. And I was by myself, and this little boy, he's really started making moves, let me know that he was alive and so forth. And I had there was a German aircraft in the area, and he wouldn't fool with me, he wouldn't tangle with me, but he'd try to get at the parachute guy. And of course we worked with a controller, a central controller, and I'd radioed in that what I had, the condition I had, and I learned later that he got down just barely inside the American lines up along the Rhine River.
Oof. Wow. Well, let's get back to training and get you across the overseas here. So what I was getting at was the difference in personalities that it takes to do what you were going to do, which was combat pilot for a single-engine fighter plane, right?
Well,
and there was a recon element.
Well, they had MOSs is what they call them. I had really the highest MOS that the Air Force had because I went through 2 training units. I went through a fighter. I was qualified as a fighter pilot, and then I had to go through another training process for tactical reconnaissance. And in fact, it's very interesting. To show you how effective the reconnaissance work was, the Germans they gave credit for 2 kills for any tactical reconnaissance pilot that their fighters could get to. You know, they didn't like us. We could see what they were doing, and we told people, and they didn't
put
like
a high
that.
value on that.
Yeah.
So that probably made you feel a little squirmy.
All in a day's work.
So who were some of the people that you trained with, and did they become your group?
Oh, yeah. In fact, it's interesting. I was looking at some of the memorabilia that I've got, and I was what really brought back memories because I hadn't realized how many fellows were with me in that primary stage that I ended up going overseas with as replacement pilots. We all got split up overseas because we were replacements. You know, we weren't a whole unit as such. But
what years were you training?
I was in. I graduated in the class that you had a different class every 2 months, and I was in 44A. I was the first class to go in 40. You graduate in 44, get your wings and your bars, and in each phase was about a 2-month period. You'd be an underclassman and an upperclassman. You go through primary and then basic and advanced. And you just went up larger aircraft, obviously, and then they did have a little transition period right after we got our wings and our bars, but we had a little transition period in fighters, because as we graduated at a single-engine advanced training unit, and so we were single-engine pilots. All of the fighter pilots, they were trained in Florida. The whole state of Florida was just one mass of replacement training units, and Tallahassee was the headquarters. Now all of your multi-engine pilots, they were out here in the West, the Midwest, and then the twin-engine fighter pilots, which were P-38s, were trained on the West Coast. So they had it all well organized.
What equipment did you train on before you got
I flew
sent overseas?
The primary trainers, which was a PT-19A and a BT-13 and an AT-6. Now that doesn't mean anything to you, but that's the way they designate them. And then we had 10 hours of P-40 transition time in our advanced training before we graduated. And then after we got that done, then I went through a fighter pilot training situation, which was P-40s. I flew P-40s and the 51s, and then when they drafted us into this TAC recon situation, we went on to Meridian, Mississippi, which was a TAC recon training area, and they put us in P-51s down there. And we were, so, I mean, I was trained in gunnery and bombing and everything fighter-wise, you know.
What was your favorite aspect of the time before you were sent overseas? Was
Well,
it learning the new stuff or the new equipment, or?
I tell you what, Corey, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't a fun outing. It was all business.
Okay.
And you know, I've often said it would really been fun to spend that taxpayers' money if there hadn't been a lot of combat involved with it, you know.
It seems like maybe that time has been romanticized to some degree, so I'm guessing it was
definitely
pretty
has.
tough.
Very,
tough
very
as
emphatically. There's really no romance to it where I could see coming from it, and then, as fate would have it, the strip that I flew out of up in Belgium, Charleroi, Belgium, was an area right where the Germans had a mass grave, you know, and the Belgians were exhuming them to try to identify them and give them proper burial. And so I thought, boy, this isn't very inspiring to go out among all these coffins, bodies stacked like cordwood, to get in your airplane, you know. But it fit the mood.
Let's in the timeline of your time, let's get you from Meridian, Mississippi, it sounds like, or Florida, wherever your last
Meridian, Mississippi.
training was, to overseas. How did that happen?
Well, just
did you get a call one day?
Yeah,
or?
September. No, we were a unit. We were drafted as a unit. Normally, they had used volunteers for tactical reconnaissance pilots, but the reconnaissance work had gained just a magnitude and was so important that they were making more squadrons and they needed replacements, and it was a going business at that time. So when we finished down at Meridian, they just took us as a group, and we headed for Europe. And
what time was that? What year?
Oh, that was September 1944. I graduated in January, and we got all this training and stuff out of the way by about September. And we went to New York and went overseas in a convoy.
And what was your knowledge of the status of the war at that time? Did it feel like it was
oh, yes,
at full tilt or coming to a close? Or
No. It was very much very volatile, and it was going in a good direction. But going overseas in that convoy, there was still the Wolf Pack was working out there. We lost a couple ships and due to torpedoes. And
what
so
ship were you on? Do you recall?
Well, I'll tell you something interesting about that. It was I think it was an Australian ship, if I'm not mistaken. But I was reading a National Geographic one time after the war. What do I see in this Geographic? But a picture of that ship. It was a tour ship for down around Australia someplace. And I saw a picture of it in the National Geographic, which was quite impressive.
So, what were you guys feeling like on this troop ship going across the ocean and knowing that?
Well, we wish we weren't there, obviously. You know, I mean, it was not a thing you rejoiced about.
Were you scared, or did you write letters home? What did you do?
Well, I think what you're driving at is a good point. As I said, it wasn't a lark. It wasn't anything that you'd picked out to do. You're in a convoy. You're seeing ships sunk. You're seeing
around you.
Oh yes, and there were. The whole ship was just loaded with human beings. You know, it was a troop ship. That's what it was, and so I mean, from all the way through, it was a very serious situation. And
do you recall what ships were sunk near you?
No, I don't remember. I mean, it's a big Navy convoy. They were out on the edge. We didn't see them. It happened at night, you know, and then we got into England and.
What port?
Oh, Southampton, I think. I can't remember. If I hadn't been put into this TAC recon pilot work, I would have probably, I would have been in England for Normandy, with the invasion. But see, so when I got there, we landed, we went across the channel, and landed at Normandy with troops, you know, because there were a bunch of replacement pilots. I had an interesting experience in that, doing that, in that we got over there and we were on an LCI, a landing craft infantry. They had ramps up each side. They'd run up on the beach and boys would go off. And they dropped the anchor, and we got ready to go in on the tide, and the anchor was hooked on a tank or something. So we missed 2 tides, and I set out in the channel on that LCI during the worst storm that ever hit the English Channel. They had these big docks that they had built, for the invasion, and they were flying around like canoes. And finally they run that ship up, we missed about 2 or 3 tides, and they finally run up on the beach, and we got off, and I see these pictures of these combat guys carrying this stuff on their head, Well, that's what we had to do. And and then I forgot to tell you,
What day was that? Do you recall?
Well, I don't remember what it was. The date I don't remember on that, Corby. But I got to tell you.
Go ahead.
I told you they got that anchor hooked on a tank or something. And so then when they decided we could go in, they couldn't get the engine started on this winch to pull it. What they do, they drop the stern tanker off, and then they run up on the beach, and then they pull it off on that anchor, see. And so the Navy, they're eating all their good food, and again, that boat is just loaded with human beings, it's replacement. And finally, when the Navy was in eating their food, a couple of Air Force crew chiefs got down there, and they got that engine going. But the thing is, and so then they started to try to pull the anchor up, and they broke the cable. So they got no stern anchor to pull that thing off the beach on. So that's when they run it up, and we had to wade up to our waist carrying our gear on,
What kind of gear did you have with you?
Well, we had clothing and we had equipment bags and so forth with winter flying gear and stuff like that. Well, half of which we lost. It was stacked on the deck of this boat, and we rode that storm out, and it just washed the stuff right off the deck,
What was it like riding the storm out?
No, well, it wasn't. I didn't like it because I'm not a Navy guy. Just like I told that gentleman who's here ahead of me. I mean, the Navy I have a lot of respect for. Because you asked earlier, why'd you want to do this or why'd you do it? Well, I told you one thing I didn't want to do, and that was being in the Navy. I would have been a Marine if I hadn't been in the Air Force. But so it. I could write a book about that crossing that channel. That was a wild
Tell us
experience.
if you think of a story or two about that. Go ahead.
Well, no, that's basically it.
Harrowing would be the word.
They never did get that ship off the beach. I flew down there to look at it, check around, and they run cats up and they dug all around it. And they never did get it back in the ocean.
So let's form you up with your 107th. Is that who?
107th, yeah.
How did you form up?
Well, we just we got on the red ball line, and then they hauled us up in trucks, and we got up there and up in Charleroi, Belgium, which is up on the Meuse River. Up there it's south, well, a little bit south, east of Brussels, but the squadron had just moved up there. See, my squadron flew attack recon out of England, obviously, before they took off and got across the channel on it. And it was very primitive. We lived in an old chateau. It looked like movie stuff, really. But it was, in that area, from Charleroi on up through Cologne, up to Kassel down to Frankfurt, Eschwege, know it like the back of my hand, because we navigated to 6 place coordinates, and we would find Germans and doing stuff in the woods, and we'd get to control it. We get them down. You see that woods? Well, they're in the southwest corner of that, And then we used to have an interesting experience every now and then too. Sometimes they'd send in fighter bombers, P-47s, and those guys had their fighter training, and they weren't, navigation-wise trained to the extent what we were. And so we would sometimes lead them in on the first run or two to show them where it was and get out of there when the things started popping.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about when you first got with your replacement.
Mm-hmm.
You joined the 107th
TAC Recon.
TAC Recon. And what rank did you join as?
Well, we were commissioned second lieutenants, and when we got our wings, and we were still second lieutenants, and then I got first promoted during the middle of the tour, and then ended up a captain.
So in those first weeks of being with the TAC Recon, did someone take you under their wing, or so to speak, or was there a
no, you know
camaraderie there that you?
What they do with an Air Force, if you're supposed to fly an airplane, they put you in and see if you can fly. Yeah, that's about it. You know.
So the first time you went out with them in Europe, what was that like? Do you remember that flight?
Well, specifically, but I'll tell you what we had. We were flying these P-51s, and we had guns. We were armed, and then they had behind the armor plate, behind the pilot, they had a big camera in there, which we used for authentication purpose. In other words, when we would call our controller and report something, boom, we'd take pictures of it. And so consequently, those airplanes with those cameras in there, the way they were installed on their size and so forth, aerodynamically, we're not supposed to fly. So we would never fly with wing tanks, because we weren't supposed to be doing with the cameras. So consequently, we got all of the real short strips. This strip that we had was 2,200 feet. Well, just you get the relativity. The fighter bombers and the bombers in England are flying off 6,000 and 7,000 and 9,000 feet runways, and so we had this sod strip up there, and man, it wasn't a matter of how good they wanted us to be; it's how good we had to be to get in and out of this thing. In fact, it was sod until the snow started flying, and it had a lake in the middle of it, and not just
of the runway.
In the middle of the runway, and if you would go to take off and you wouldn't get airborne by the time you hit that lake, those P-51s had big air scoops underneath them, and get full of mud, and they kept a fire truck out at the end of the runway, and you go around and land, and they get up there and they clean it all out, and you try it again. So, with those type of facilities, you had no latitude in your flying ability. Either you had to do it, or you had a problem.
Swim, so to speak.
And it was very interesting, as luck would have it, at the end of the strip was at Charleroi was what the Shoaf brick factory. And it had a big brick wall along the side that the fuel was on. And the 8th Air Force fighters would get low on fuel or get shot up, and they'd fly over and they'd look down and see P-51 sitting down there. So they think it's a 51 strip. Well, it was. But it wasn't the 6,000 strip that they'd left in England. And we had a pile of wrecked aircraft. The end and half of it were 8th Air Force fighters. And you know what the other half was? The replacement pilots bringing our replacement ships in. We finally sent a directive to headquarters that we would send our pilots down to pick up our replacement aircraft so we could get them in there. And as I say, I don't say that bragging, but that is the flying challenge that was involved with the situation.
Interesting.
So as I say, there was no joyride or nobody hand-holding you. If you got in and out of the place alive, you were doing your job.
Tell me about the 107th. Who was in charge of the entire?
Well, it was a 107th Squadron. Well, it was a group. It was a TAC Recon group, and the Tactical Recon group was 2 P-51 TAC Recon squadrons and 1 P-38 Photo Recon.
20 planes each squadron, is that right?
No, we had 3 squadrons to make the group up.
How many planes per squadron?
Oh, I don't know. They had 30 or 40, whatever it was. And your Photo Recon boys, they flew by themselves, and they had no guns. They had no guns, but they were flying P-38s that had supercharged engines on for a high altitude. We flew. We had to do visual reconnaissance. We flew at about 10,000 feet, but they'd take off and just climb out of sight, go up way high, for the photo recon work.
Do you have names of people that you started out with there? Right. When
Oh,
you got
a
there?
bunch of beautiful, beautiful people will always be a part of my life. I mean, they're just buddies. That's all there is to it.
Anyone in particular that stands out?
Yeah,
Is worth
yeah. I had
talking
one.
about?
His name was Snitzer, Stan Snitzer, and he was a kind of an unusual guy in that he had transferred in from the West Coast. He'd had his training in P-38s, and and with the juggling of things that the military can do so very aptly, somehow he ended up back here in Florida in the fighter school, and he was my buddy. He was my buddy, and he was the group I was in a little bit older because the Air Force had a glider pilot program going in preparation for the invasions. That's where those pilots come from. That flew those babies, and they had enough of them. And remember, I'm telling you, see, this was during the summer of 44, and the invasion was in the end of 44. Mm-hmm. And
December.
Yeah, and so they cut off the glider pilot program, and they took all those fellows and put them into pilot training. So I was with an older bunch, a little bit older, maybe about a year or two or something, but good old boys. And so as I said, I don't know how Snitzer ended up there, but anyhow.
Where was he from?
He was from in Arizona, and he had a family. He didn't know if he had a family. In fact, he had a wife, is what I should say, because he was expecting his family when we went overseas. Mm-hmm. And then he arrived. Stanley Jr. arrived while we were over in Belgium over there, and but they were just all good old boys, and they could all fly.
So let's get to you getting up in the air with this group.
Well,
do you recall the first time that so we talked about your first flight. You didn't necessarily recall, but do you remember the first time you met resistance or you had?
Well, as I say, the resistance part of it was unusual in that, as I've told you, we flew in pairs. We didn't fly a whole squadron, a whole bunch of aircraft. We flew in pairs, and in fact, they had a term. We dove and turned. You never flew straight at 10,000 feet because you were just setting ducks for anti-aircraft stuff. And so they call that jinking. We jink all the time, and as I said, the number one, the fellow leading the flight would be doing the visual reconnaissance. You'd have a pad on your knee. You'd write it. You'd take a picture and da-da-da-da. The number two guy just never knew where he was. He was just flying cover for it. And so we, as I say, we were jumped all the time by every type of aircraft. The record was 4. I had 4 different type of aircraft. Jumped me one time on one mission. There was 2 of them were British. No, one was British, one was American, and 2 were Germans. And but
Did you ever find out who was piloting those planes?
No, you didn't. And as I told you, the one time I got shot up was Spitfires, and there was as good a chance that there were Germans flying it as there was British flying it.
And we talked before we were on camera about that. What would happen would be that Allied pilots would surrender their planes by landing at a.
Well, that was, yeah.
And then the Germans would take them over and use them against you?
Well, that happened. What we were talking about before the show was that it was at the end of the war. It was at the end of the war. We ended up, we moved about 4 times from after we left that strip in Belgium I was just telling you about. And we ended up in near Kassel, Germany, up a little strip called Eschwege up there. And what I was telling you about there was that we had German aircraft coming in surrendering because the war was over. The Germans are up along the Elbe River, and 10 miles one direction was Russians, and 10 miles the other direction was the Americans. In fact, I think about my last 10 missions were just, they told us not to shoot, it was just surveillance, just to watch
what's going on.
So at that stage, this was a very prominent German facility we were flying out of. It had been their experimental facility, and so it was well known with the German Air Force. And we had these Germans flying in and surrendering. They come in usually in the evening, it'd be about evening, you know, and we had Stuka dive bombers and all sorts of German aircraft in there, and of course it was just a little bit hairy when they first started doing it, you know. Our aircraft, we had anti-aircraft guys all on our field, but they'd let them do it. Well, and after going long, it was identified it was going to be a standard procedure, and
there was no particular message they could send to you to say.
No, there was no way they could do that. They
so
just
well,
the main thing you would do, Corey, is if you had like you're flying a Focke-Wulf fighter or something like that, you drop your gear, put your landing gear down, and fly around very conspicuously, and work your way in.
I see.
And get in. You wouldn't come screaming in there and point your nose down and your wheels up and your guns loaded, you know. But
let's go back to the Belgium strip, and tell me about the P-51. Let's spend a couple minutes just describing what it was like to fly that particular airplane.
I could talk about that airplane from now till hell freezes over, because it was just, I loved it.
Did you have your own plane, or did you change planes?
We had aircraft assigned to us. In fact, mine, just before we started the move through Belgium, with another pilot in it, took a direct hit, and it
from
come
ground
up.
fire?
An aircraft. It come up through the wing, and went off behind the armor plate, blew the canopy off, and everything else.
While you were flying it?
But no, not while I was. Another pilot had it.
Okay.
It was used in automation. But as far as the 51 is concerned, when we were flying here in the United States in transition, we had the first 51s had straight canopies on them, and there were the B's and C's, and so we can say, well, we get overseas, we'll have the new D's, the fancy one, you know, bubble hatch, the whole 9 yards. And we got over. First thing you do, you know, you go out and see what airplanes you got assigned to you, you know. And I went out, and my airplane was sitting there, and I says, "What is it?" I've never seen anything like it before in my life, and it was a P-51A. They had a P-51, and then which was a dive bomber, and then they had a P-51A, and then B, C's, and D's. It had the engine. It had an same engine in as a P-40. And it was a very efficient aircraft at low altitude, but it didn't have a good supercharge on it. So that's what my first aircraft was a P-51A, and I flew 18 missions in it. And in fact, I flew one mission in the morning, and I had another one to go in the afternoon, and we got a memorandum in that they were all declared war weary, that we couldn't fly them in combat anymore. So and what we did with them, we had...
war weary meaning it's worn out.
Well, that's the definition. It's just like the P-40s. They took them out of combat because they had better aircraft. And
so 18 missions.
Well, that was just very early in my tour, but so we took those, and I know what I want to tell you. So what did we do with them? The Germans had jets. They had Messerschmitt jets. We didn't have them, and they were very effective. They didn't have enough of them. They could have done a lot with the war if they'd had enough to use them. They had them in time, but their famous trick was to be screaming around in these jets, and they'd find aircraft landing with the gear and stuff down, and then they would swoop in, and you know, when you got your gear down, you're a dead duck, you know. And so they would shoot them down, shoot planes down. Well, we didn't have as major problem as the fighter boys did, because they'd become a whole squadron back, and they would get into a traffic pattern and get strung out all over Europe, and they were very vulnerable. And the Germans had some good kills on them. But so we had a directive come out. We had runway alerts. So we had airplanes at both ends of the runway with pilots 24 hours, well, not 24 hours, but all daylight hours a day. And so we said, they took those P-51A, which were great, anything from 10,000 feet down, and they could fly inside of a Spitfire.
Talk about the maneuverability, the performance of that particular plane.
fine aircraft.
How fast? What kind of?
Well, I'll give you a comparison. You take a P-40, for example. That was the aircraft before the 51 come into it. I mean, that's what your flying Tigers were flying in the CBI, and you've read about, seen them with a shark mouth on them and so forth. And that was a manual airplane to fly. You had physically, you had to fly it. You could do it if you knew it. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was the whole thing. If you lived through that learning period, you were in good shape. If you didn't, it'd get you. But that airplane had so much torque in it. Torque is, you know what that is, as a propeller. You could drop the nose and let it cruise, get up to about 350, 400, and it would do a slow roll just from the torque from the engine. Well, of course, the P-51, you sit there and you flew it with 2 fingers. I mean, you know, just so that gives you some perspective of what the type of aircraft it was.
And it was armed with, what were you armed with?
Well, it was armed with 50 caliber machine guns. The later models, the Ds, had 6, and like my little old P-51A and the Bs and the Cs had 4, 2 or 3 in each wing.
On a trigger?
On a sticker.
How accurate could you be with that? And
well,
did you get to fire your weapon?
You had to learn to shoot them. The big thing was you know, the handling of your sights. You had a sight on there, and it was an optical sight too. It had originally, the first P-51s that I flew had that old iron sight. I had the ring out and on the nose and so forth. But and then the main thing is, and when you fired gunnery in an airplane, and actually a fighter is a gun platform. It ain't an airplane, it's a gun platform. You're flying that platform. Mm-hmm. And you've got certain things that you've got to be capable of handling. You know, like, for example, you've got to keep it trimmed. Mm-hmm. You know, if your airplane is not trimmed, it's going this way, but it's pointing this way, and your guns are going shooting over there where it's pointing. Very elementary, but that's the way it works. Okay. And when you fire gunnery in a fighter like that, it's never long bursts. Because get it out there, and plus the fact you want to conserve ammunition.
And you have tracers. You could see where.
Oh, you could see the tracers, and you could see the tracers were shooting at you too.
Let's talk about a little bit about air combat. Did you?
Well, mine was mostly a shoot and go situation because you know we weren't. In fact, technically we weren't supposed to shoot. I mean, we were on instructions not to shoot because this reconnaissance, tactical reconnaissance thing we were doing was vitally important. I mean,
what are some of the more important things that you scouted?
Well, everything. You know, it'd be railway, it could be infantry, it could be, you know, guns, everything, just people. And it started out real slow. When it was, as I say, it started out as the observation. It was National Guard observation at the beginning of the war, and that was just visual. And another thing that come out of it is it caught on. In other words, they honed it down. They got the procedure so it was effective. And then the big thing in that was that the Army generals and so forth, and it started accepting it and having confidence in it. And the minute that happened, it took off. In fact, we worked with a controller, and it even got to the point where we'd send a pilot up on controller duty to do the radio work with our controller, you know, do the lingo and so forth, and just being able to handle it more efficiently. And in fact, when the war ended, I was down, as I told you, we went to a point system, and everybody was rated on their time and so forth. And I had a lot of points, obviously, and all the rest of the pilots did. So the low point people were supposed to say, sir, the high point people they were going to bring home. So some of these generals got over in the CBI theater that we had worked with there in Europe, and it was our group, and they just beat the drums till they got our group ordered over there to redeploy direct. This is after the war with Germany ended to the CBI, and so we had to take all of these high point people out and bring in low point people, but that only indicates, you know, the belief that they finally got into TAC recon.
Staying in Europe, what was the high point of your action there? Like, do you consider it to have been exciting or scary, or, and if so, what was the one particular? Was it the Battle of the Bulge, which I believe you were part of?
Well, that was probably, yeah.
Normandy, were you there?
Let me get this thing straight. It wasn't highlighting that it was fun and really a great experience.
No,
I mean,
I'm sure.
It was probably the most spectacular thing that I got involved with. You're probably familiar with the pattern of the Battle of the Bulge. It was a weather situation. Obviously, it was the last big drive that the Germans made, and they waited till they thought the weather would be as bad as it could be, and it was. And so, being in that experience, we were the first mission in there after the weather broke, and it was something to see, I'll tell you.
What did you see?
You
and your wing.
Well, in this case, I was flying with the
CO.
CO. He asked me to go as his wingman. Well, that's always an honor. Fine, I'll go. And he was an old boy from Texas, and and he had a kind of a Texas drawl. And he called our controller, and he called sweepstakes. And, he said, "Well, I got a bunch of German men around here, and da-da-da." And pretty soon he said, "Holy mackerel, I got the whole German army down here." And they were there. We stretched that mission out. We throttled back, and when they started sending in fighter bomber groups, and we were placing them around there on the stuff, and we got over 3 hours out of that mission, which was the longest attack recon mission I ever got. In fact, I ran out of gas getting back to the dispersal area after I landed. So that was a big experience. That was something. But the rest, as far as it's just war, no big thrill to it. You don't like it. The thing that really hammered me when I first got over there, all going prowling around Germany, the devastation, the ruin. You go over Cologne, and it's on the Rhine, and you look down, and from 10,000 feet, the town was flat. But here was this Cologne cathedral sitting there, and it looked intact. When you get down low, you can see it was gutted. Those flying buttresses that they put on them, it stood it up. But I mean, the thought that I had, when I see it, I mean, boy, this just never can happen in the United States. There's just no way, And so when I see a lot of this current controversy we're putting up with daily on our CB and on our TVs, I'm not a happy camper.
No.
And that'd be another story, and I'd be glad to sit here and talk about it anytime you want.
Yeah. Tell me about it.
Well, basically, I'm being facetious a little bit, but we're talking about war. Now, all these people that are saying, first of all, I'll give you a quick shot. You asked for it. The situation with Iraq, this terrorism, it shouldn't be called war. It's not a war. It's not a war. Hey, there's been 3,000 people killed, and that's an awful lot. One is too many. But you take the Battle of the Bulge, there was something like 80,000 Americans and 100 and some plus Germans killed. You got all those battles down in the Pacific, Iwo Jima, the rest of them, and what happened in Japan. That's war. And
two countries facing off.
Yeah, you got something tangible. I was looking for a guy.
What would you call what we're in now?
It's a good name. I've thought about that, Corey. I can't come up with a really appropriate name, but there's got to be. Maybe you're going to dream up a name for it. But it ain't. As I say, what I tell you about Cologne, that's war. And I got a picture in there. I got the Remagen Bridge standing there. That's war. And as I say, politics. I just don't like them. I don't believe in them.
Tell me about how you feel about air superiority. That must have been a big thing for you pilots to know that you own the sky.
And it was a struggle. And as I mentioned, those German jets, if they'd have got those things, 12, 24 months earlier, they were superior. The P-51 is what turned that tide around. But no, it's and nowadays, of course, and the thing is, they're talking about the development of the attack reconnaissance. Now they got reconnaissance, where they got stealth aircraft, they got pilotless aircraft, they've got cameras that can take pictures of a brick wall, you know.
Satellite.
Oh, yes. You just can't believe the stuff that they have now.
Would you like to be of the age to be able to use that equipment that they have now?
Yeah, it would be interesting. It would be, and as I've always said, that would have been a hell of an experience if it hadn't been a war going on.
Yeah, right.
To go through that flight training and all that, you know. But it's,
Once I wrecked a car into a ditch, and I thought, man, if I could do that again without getting hurt, that would be fun to do again. And that has nothing to do with it. But I can imagine.
See, I like to have you on my wing. You'd have been a good wingman. I'd fly with you.
All right. So you attained the rank of captain.
Yeah.
At what time? And let's sort of like move towards the end of the war for you.
Well, it was when when we changed the squadron over, they had 4 guys had to stay, and we some of us had hundreds of points, you know, and 60, 70 missions over the 3 or 4 years and stuff like that. And but they needed 4 people, and they needed 3 flight leaders and an operations officer, and they put names in a hat. And I was lucky. I got drawn out. I didn't think so at the time, but the way it worked out, it was, because then we moved in all these high point men, and we set up a training program. This is something, flying training over area where you've been flying combat. I mean, that's really seems like a very futile thing to do when you're doing it. Mm-hmm. But so when the war, we were down at Marseille getting on boats, ready to go to CBI, redeploy, and the war ended in Japan, and so that they had to, set up a plan B for everything. So they just changed our orders to redeploy to the CBI via the USA. That was just about the extent of the wording on it.
What was your reaction when you heard that Hitler was dead and that the war in Europe was essentially over?
Oh,
where were you? What were you doing when that
happened? I was setting up at Eschwege, Germany. We were flying out of this town near Kassel, and obviously it was a relief, but it wasn't a total relief because there was another war going on.
And then, what was your reaction when the war in Japan was finally over?
Well, I got out a bottle of scotch and done the proper thing.
What did you do?
I celebrated.
With who?
Stanislaus Snitzer.
Where at? What did you do?
Oh yeah, we were down in Marseille, and
that's France, is that?
No, southern France. Uh-huh. And he'd got drawn like I had, my old buddy. We both got our hats full out of
4, huh?
Yeah, 4 out of about 30 or 40, but it worked out. My joke is I think that some of those guys behind us are still sitting over in Marseille waiting for a boat,
Probably not a bad place once the war was over, too.
Yeah.
How did you end up, let's see, so you came back to CBI via the United States, but they stopped you there and said you're essentially...
Well, no, we come back to the United States in just about a year. It was interesting, the time overseas. But so I come back, and I... got out of, at the time, I got out of Camp Gramp where I got in. But I joined, and then I enlisted in the reserve, and I was flying.
Why did you do that?
Because I liked the military aspect of it. I liked flying. And
how old were you at this time?
Oh, I was probably about 23, 24, something like that. And then, the rest of that story. So the reserve unit I could get around was geographically in the picture was out of Chicago, out of O'Hare Field, but it was a troop carrier wing. They flew twin engine, big C-46s, big transport. But it was flying, and they had a part of their program where they used an AT-6, a single engine aircraft, to have the twin engine boys do some front seat flying. I don't know why, it's military thinking, but they did. So I was flying out of the back seat, and then they discontinued that. And then about that time, the Korean War come along, and at that time I'd started my business and started a family, and I wasn't very enthused about that. Had an interesting experience. The commanding officer of our wing, of this troop courier wing, reserve courier wing, come out to Dixon, and I had another good friend of mine who was a navigator, Johnny Selgerstedt. We went in back and forth together, and he got to be good friends with the colonel, and the colonel would come out and hunt with John, and so they had a 4-squadron troop courier wing in there, and they had plenty of pilots and stuff, but they was short on enlistment, so they cut it down to a 3-squadron wing. Mm-hmm. And this colonel called John and told him the situation. He says, "What do you think about Lee?" And he said, "Well, you should talk to him and see if he wants what he wants to do." And John said, "I don't have to talk to him."
You didn't want to go to Korea.
No way. No.
Would you have gone if they had made
Sure,
you?
I would have got back into fighters as soon as I got over there, though.
That would have been jets
I
at that
would
point,
have,
right?
yeah, been probably. Well, they had a lot of 51s over there too.
Oh, really?
In Korea. Yeah, they were still using them, and but
Tell me about your family.
Well, I have 2 sons and a daughter. My daughter and her family, they live down at Durango. My one son lives here in Aspen. Jeff, you might know him. And the other son, he lives in at Schaumburg. I was in Aspen in the early 70s, and done some business, and the boys come over, and they were all instructors. And the one that's in Schaumburg, Tripper broke his leg real bad, so he had to go back east. He took him 2 years to get it back together. And the other one that's here in Aspen, he just never left Aspen. He's been here ever since. And so about 3 or 4 years ago, I decided I was just going to turn into be an Aspenite.
Yeah, where did you spend the, say, like Korean War years until you came to Aspen in the 2000s?
Well, I was in the Midwest. I was in the Dixon and Rockford area. I had
what business
a lot of
did you hold?
businesses. I had an advertising agency for about 35 years. And
Like your dad?
Pardon?
Like your dad, in a way.
Yeah, well, that's where the advertising got in my blood, that's for
So it's
sure.
interesting. Your dad was a pilot and an advertiser, and
He was yeah.
or at least he was a gunner. He was in aviation.
Yeah. Well, he that had a lot to do with it. But and then just a little bit of everything besides that: finances, construction, development.
What did you find to be the one theme of these different businesses that you pursued after the war
Promotion.
that was interesting to you?
Promotion, really, like
Really?
advertising,
Okay.
and fun, and just general businesses. And that's back in the era when businesses weren't run by computers.
Right.
So it's a whole different era.
Did you ever use your pilot skills to use? Did a commercial plane ever the pilot get sick and you were on, or
well,
anything
here's
like that?
here's a situation like after the war. If you want to go commercial flying, airlines were the best thing, and of course pilots were a dime a dozen, and single engine pilots, they weren't even pilots as far as the airlines were concerned. See,
They wanted the bomber pilots.
Yeah, the bomber pilots.
Move people around.
Take that, and I in fact I used to rent an airplane a lot. When my boys were small, they loved it. My dad, he'd go for an airplane ride anytime I'd open the door, But so then after my boys grew up and so forth, I drifted away from that. It got to be financially not a desirable situation,
Expensive to fly.
Yeah.
When the government's not paying for it.
Yeah.
Did
And
you
it wasn't really too much fun.
Did you ever fly into Aspen?
I never flown in Aspen. Well, I've flown in Aspen, but I mean with
You've never,
somebody
like,
else.
piloted?
I've never piloted.
Seems challenging. Like
Yeah,
that short
yeah.
strip you talked about.
Well,
with the lake in the
hey,
middle.
this strip, why we would have given anything at something like that in the war. And then they back to that strip I was telling you about. We started out with dirt, and then it started getting muddy. So we moved down to Mons, about 150 miles east of Charleroi, and they put a mat down. You've seen the pictures of the old mats they used to have with the holes in them and stuff like that. And then the winter that we flew over there in Europe was the worst winter that Europe's had in a long time. I don't think they've had one as bad since. That storm I got into down in the Channel. And and they plow the snow off, and they'd have to top the snow along the strip, because if you got over there, if you get over too far, your wings will get it, and they get you in the wing. And I tell you what, you had to be a young guy to do that kind of flying. You really did. Because it was all automatic. You didn't think anything about it. You didn't brag about it. It was just what you paid to do, and you taught how to do it, But
I think we're probably nearing the end of the interview. Is there any story in particular or thing you learned that you'd like to pass on?
Well, the main thing, my reflection on this whole thing, we touched on briefly when we talked about what's going on in the world. Mm-hmm. I think about that in the light that we discussed it. Because I think it's just a fallacy. People are out of sight, out of mind. Time flies, At 9/11, the mayor of New York, he was a hero now. He's having family problems. He's been married 2 or 3 times, and stuff like this. We're going to pot.
Yeah. Do you think there's a way out of this? Have you thought about how America can regain its good standing in the world?
Well, everybody is we don't think for ourselves anymore. With your TV, that's what we think about. The greatest. Well, my hobby is news. I want to know what's going on in the world. And what I do, I listen to all of them. I listen to Fox, CNN, and so forth, because you're getting both sides of it. And you get a different story. And the American people are going to have to get their head out of the cockpit and realize where their direction is coming from.
Right.
And start making their own decisions. And I hope they can cut it. At my age, it ain't going to be my problem.
Well, I think it's been an interesting time talking to you here.
Well, bless you.
Is there anything in particular that you want to add to that, or should we leave it there?
That's what's good enough for me.
Well, thank you so much, Lee.
Bless you.
Lee Shoaf, 85 years old. He is a captain in the Army Air Corps, a P-51 pilot, here today as part of the Aspen Veterans History Project. Today's March 16th. It's a Friday. And I want to be sure to thank Mr. Dick Merritt and Daryl Grobe, some of the Aspen the veterans who have helped put this together, and really thank the Thrift Shop and the Aspen Elks Club who sponsored these filmings, and these interviews are going to be going to the Library of Congress for the permanent record of the United States military. And I want to thank Lee for serving, and I appreciate you being here today to talk to us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, sir.
Thank you.